Hi, and welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show, the show for animal training and behaviour nerds, where I, Ryan Cartledge, interview the world's most proficient animal training and behaviour geeks. We're absolutely thrilled and grateful to have you here with us today. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on whatever you're listening to this on so that you don't miss a single episode. Each episode of this show is brought to you on behalf of the ATA membership. And if you like the conversations in this episode, then you're invited to continue them with like-minded behaviour nerds within the membership area, which you can find out more about at www.animaltrainingacademy.com. You'll get access to twice monthly live web classes, the back catalogue of previous web class replays, plus a huge library of videos and projects to help problem solve your training challenges. Plus, we're a sociable bunch with an exclusive private Facebook group and forum areas. It's like a Netflix social media platform for animal behaviour geeks. But we will get started on today's episode where we'll be talking to one Kim Brophey. Kim is a certified dog behaviour consultant through the IAABC, CDBC, certified professional dog trainer knowledge assessed through the Certification Council for Professional Dog Trainers, CPDTKA, and Family Dog Mediator, FDM, and applied ethologist and owner of the Dog Door Behaviour Centre in Asheville, North Carolina. Kim's commitment to family dog mediation has been recognised internationally. She has been awarded the APDT Outstanding Trainer of the Year in 2009 and the Best Dog Trainer of Western North Carolina 7 years in a row. She is a member of the International Society for Applied Ethology, the Association of Professional Dog Trainers, and a certified member and past board member of the International Association of Animal Behaviour Consultants. Kim Dog's Legs model of comprehensive canine science has been endorsed by prominent canine scientists such as Raymond Coppinger and embraced by reputable dog trainers worldwide. From her applied ethology content in Michael Shikashio's Aggression in Dogs Master Course to her highly anticipated market-disrupting applied ethology and family dog mediation course, Kim's work is a celebrated contribution to the field. Her groundbreaking book, Meet Your Dog, TED Talk, and Beyond the Operant BTO Collaborative have made profound waves and became favourites among both dog professionals and the public. Kim continues to build bridges and invite others to contribute to a new conversation about dogs, one that challenges us to redefine how we perceive, talk about, and treat our canine companions as a society. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Kim to the show today, who is patiently waiting by. Hey Kim, thanks so much for taking the time to come and hang out with us at Animal Training Academy.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ryan. I'm really glad to be on your show.
And today is a day in our membership community where we start reading your book by that wonderful David Thatcher. If you're listening, David, thank you, who runs our book club in that community. So I'm excited to dive into that after the recording of this podcast episode, which isn't the ideal order, but hey, we'll go with that. Let's dive straight into the first question today, Kim. We love to hear about people's journeys, and we're wondering if you could please take us back to where you first got started in your career working with dog behaviour. And we love stories here on the podcast, so we welcome you sharing any stories with us from your journey as well.
So I grew up in Atlanta, and even though it was a big city, there was, of course, tons of opportunities and, backyards and parks and things like that for me to be out exploring as my early ethologist self. And, of course, at that time, the dogs were still loose, even in that big city. So I spent a large part of my childhood just following them around, curious about their behavior. So I think really, the ethologist in me goes way back. But as far as my professional journey, once I was in college working on my applied ethology degree, as I started getting into the world of professional dog training as part of all that, what was interesting is that the actual industry of dog training at the time was pretty old school. Not a lot of science of animal behavior and learning present there. But the Delta Society at the time was was an organization here in the U.S. that trained service and therapy dogs, and they were putting out some really good scientific literature about learning in animals. And so that organization was actually where I got a lot of my first feet wet, dipped in the water experience in the science of actual animal learning. That and a learning theory class that I had in college where we trained Sniffy the rat remotely via a computer program. So that was where I kind of got the first nuts and bolts introduction to all of it. But the industry was in a really interesting place at the time, and I just kind of found myself in the sea of different opinions and theories. Of course, not that we're too far from that now. You could argue that people are still just going back and forth about theories and practices, but at least now I think there's a stronger common denominator thread of the science of animal learning in the industry. So that's good. But yeah, I think it was always just something that was part of my natural self, just to be studying, curious about animal behavior and really trying to understand their experience.
So you went to college and studied applied ethology, you said?
Yes.
And you came out the other end of that with a master's in
no, actually, you can't even get a master's in applied ethology in the United States, which is interesting. It's very much a European field. And so I was just fortunate enough to go to a small enough liberal arts college that had an integrative studies program, so that I was able to customize my bachelor's degree in applied ethology. But you could argue I've done all my master's and even probably some doctorate level work just internationally and self-taught, and all the additional research in the decades since, because it's just had to be remote education. It wasn't something that was available here. The model in the United States at that time, and I would say still, was very much kind of the puppeteer model, which is more concerned about changing behavior than understanding behavior. And the field of applied ethology is much more welfare centric as opposed to controlling of behavior centric.
And so is that still the case, that you cannot do your master's in applied ethology in the States, or has that changed?
Yep. Yeah, that's still the case. Yeah. I mean, there are sister disciplines, right? So folks would argue that you can get a degree in animal welfare. There's some of course, animal behavior degrees, but again, the emphasis is different. So in applied ethology, the concept of that entire discipline is focusing specifically on the biological and evolutionary basis of behavior. That's the field of ethology for animals in nature, but then specifically focusing on animals that are in captive and domesticated settings under direct human control. And so it's very much a targeted niche discipline that is concerned with what happens when you take all of the natural principles of the behavioral sciences, the phenomenon of evolution, et cetera, and how things work in an ecosystem and a habitat, why behavior and learning functions the way that it does in nature. What happens when we interrupt those natural processes through domestication and captivity restraints, and then we are then interacting with them as another species ourselves, as humans, kind of the intersection of those two worlds, and all the things that can go wrong therein, and then what are our responsibilities to mediate to try to improve those circumstances. So in a way, it brings in a lot of different scientific disciplines, and then it asks some different questions. Most applied ethologists, however, internationally, this is still true, are concerned with animals that are in agriculture or in zoo settings, laboratory settings, et cetera. And very few applied ethologists internationally are focusing their work on companion animals. I think in large part because there's been kind of an underlying assumption that there couldn't possibly be welfare issues in your average, well-meaning, loving pet home. And so it just hasn't been a place that has been explored too extensively as of yet.
And why, and maybe you've already answered this, so just repeat yourself if you have. Why such a difference in focus between the two continents?
It's hard for me to say, right? Because I haven't lived in Europe, and so I'm not sure why that might have evolved that way in the first place. There's some theories that I have about maybe some kind of historical timeline things. Ethology in general kind of fell out of favor in the scientific community after World War II because the discussions and the implications of any kind of a biologic basis for behavior after World War II, understandably, was really leaving a bad taste in people's mouth because of where that line of thinking had been taken as far as humans had been concerned in recent years. And so I think there was something very appealing to our subconscious about looking at behaviorism exclusively, kind of a tabula rasa, nurture-centric as opposed to nature-centric view of behavior, where we were more interested in what was possible in the learning and development and facilitation, the education of an organism, and did move away from the kind of nature element that ethology had brought to the table. So I'm not sure whether that course, at least in America, just kind of moved forward as we went into our jolly, jaded decade of the 50s here in the United States. We just kind of never got back to it. But many of the world's most notable ethologists were also Europeans, so it just may have something to do with circumstances there. But the ideas of animal welfare have found their way here to the United States, as far as working on farms and zoos and thinking about the integrated welfare, an interdisciplinary picture of the welfare of those animals that are under human control. But I think, again, it's really been something that we have not overlapped into our discussions of pets, and particularly dogs. I think there's been a lot of projection that literally the dog's evolutionary niche is that of being a captive pet, when that is actually far from the big picture of the historical and evolutionary and then selective pressure roots of dogs in our world and in our lives. So the captivity phenomenon is actually a very recent phenomenon in terms of how widespread it is. So, most of the dogs in the world were loose, and 80% of the dogs in the world still are loose in underdeveloped nations, or not the big metropolis that we have in most places here in the United States, where leashes and crates and fences and all the rest are by far the norm for the reality for pet dogs.
Hold that thought. What the ethology? Can you do a master's in ethology? It does not apply to ethology.
Yes, exactly.
Right, okay.
Yep.
Okay. And so they're focused. The applied ethology is primarily focused on agriculture and exotics living in zoo collections, but not so much towards domestic animals. And domestic animals, one of those being dogs. So are you comparing dogs in societies that it's a norm for them to be loose versus Western societies, and what we know about the dog's evolution versus an actual wild counterpart that, from my understanding, doesn't exist?
Well, if I'm understanding your question correctly, definitely there's a difference and a comparison to be made between dogs that are still living what we think of as street dog life or village dog life, where they still have behavioral autonomy and reproductive autonomy. And so one of the things that is kind of the critical crux of the crossroads where I think dogs have become so handicapped in terms of their welfare. And this is true for other species as well, but is very much true for dogs in comparison to, say, dogs that, are living that autonomous life of a village or a street dog, even though we might judge that welfare as being much poorer. Basically, nature has two mechanisms that it can use to help an individual adapt to their circumstances for optimal fitness and survival. And then, of course, being able to reproduce and pass on those successful genes to their offspring. And so those two mechanisms are going to be individual behavioral autonomy. So having the choices of your behavior so that you can adapt to the circumstances around you. And then having reproductive autonomy. And so when we control dogs through captivity and we are controlling their choices and the opportunities and options that they have available to them, we are handicapping their first mechanism that they might be able to use in order to successfully adapt. And that is having options to change their behavior and do things differently if things aren't working well for their welfare. And then when we control the breeding, so by everything from very well-intentioned and very beneficial in a number of ways, spay-neuter programs, to controlled breeding for the sake of purebred dogs, et cetera, we're handicapping the other mechanism that nature could use to solve its own problems long-term over generations, because that's a fundamental operating law of nature, is that if it's not working well in the environment, it won't be successful and it won't be able to reproduce. And so by default, then the individuals that are left in the population are functioning successfully in those conditions. So it's this whole symbiotic process and this orchestra between these variables and elements in nature that we humans with our arrogance come in and sometimes interrupt and do a lot of damage to, not with any bad intentions, but it's definitely part of what's happening for modern dogs these days, and I think why they're in so much trouble.
So two mechanisms. One is to get optimal fitness and survival by being able to manage and modify your behavior, and the other then is to pass on genes. And they're struggling. Modern dogs and can I say dogs in Western society?
Sure, yeah.
Because that's what we're focusing on.
Yes.
And that their options to change behaviors and do things differently is limited, and they might struggle here. Can you give us an example?
Sure. Yeah. So I work with clients and as a behavior consultant, and that's still my primary job. So let's say I have a client's dog who comes to me that is the result of the artificial selective pressures of humans that have been breeding a working stock dog, a herding dog, for the particular behavioral niche of working long days on a farm in cooperation with a person, doing dynamic and complex interactive tasks that involve organizing, manipulating, affecting the behavior of other animals, other organisms in the environment, and all of the different modified predatory sequences of exaggerated eye stalk chase, that come with those types of selections. And so the dog, against its own will, has been artificially selected to be something to fit a very specific set of conditions and desires that humans had historically. And so right off the bat, from the jump, when that dog comes into a pet home environment, the dog is coming to that environment with genes that are not, by definition, the result of what worked in nature to be successful and adaptive for the individual, which is kind of the law that guides what reproduces in nature. The dog is actually the result of what humans wanted, not what worked for the dog or his ancestors. It was what we wanted. So even if it's actually against the dog's own interest in terms of what is it like living in that dog's mind and body and behavior and with the genetic instincts and impulses that it has, it doesn't matter once we've interrupted that process to us whether it works for the animal as long as it works for us. So right off the bat, you could argue that the dog is already set up in some compromised fashion, possibly carrying some behaviors that would have been fundamentally, by definition, maladaptive. So then he comes into this home environment, and not only is he set up for some behaviors that we could argue might not be adaptive and functional for his own personal welfare, but on top of that, he's actually not in the niche that he was even genetically designed for, because he's in a pet home in which he will not actually ever be working as a herding dog or a stock dog. So now this dog is experiencing, as he is developing through the course of his life, his ontogeny, at different stages, emergent behaviors, which come out at different points in development as hormones and other factors are turning little signals on. And so, controlling the expression of some of these behaviors and the timing, as well as the releasing stimuli in the environment that he might come across. So let's say a fast moving jogger at the park, or a car, a bicycle, or a skateboard that goes whizzing by when they go for their walks in the morning. And because there are no accurate, appropriate releasing stimuli for this dog that has found himself outside the intended niche that he was developed for, those other things, those other events like the bicycles, joggers, cars, etc., become accidental releasing stimuli that actually activate and turn on those latent, sitting like dormant software programs in the background on your computer, programs, if you will, for those behaviors to motivate the animal into action, and then even to reinforce the behavior for engaging in that action. And so right off the bat, then we see, this is when we get the phone call, hello, my dog has a behavior problem. He chases cars and bicycles. Please help me train him to not do this. And this is one of the sticking points where I think our industry has been chasing its tail and going on what Andrew Hale calls this, merry-go-round, the operant only merry-go-round. Not that there's anything incorrect about anything operant. It's just not everything. So if we go in there with just an operant toolbox that includes only a more immediate antecedent assessment of what the releasing stimuli are in that particular moment that catalyze the behavior, and we're not putting it in the context of the literal generations of reinforcement history for that particular behavior, we are going to ultimately be spinning around, chasing our tails yet again, trying various operant strategies to try to modify or manipulate and control that behavior, which we might be able to effectively do in the context of those particular releasers. But it ends up being whack-a-mole, because what you have is this underlying bubbling inertia, if you will, of all of those genetic latent impulses. They will find other keys to turn that lock in the environment. So, now we've worked on skateboards, we've worked on bicycles, we've worked on joggers and cars, and we have a border collie we can walk down the street who will not chase those things anymore. But then you decide to have some toddlers over for a birthday party and they all go running around in the backyard. The behavior's still right there. So it's kind of like, how can we find an appropriate outlet of expression for those natural behaviors? And this is where it connects back to the very definition of welfare, because as we all know, any one of us working with any animal in captivity, whether they be in zoos, farms, people's homes, we know from the 5 freedoms that it is important for every animal's welfare to have an opportunity to express natural behaviors. It's very essential. Otherwise, you get frustration, stereotypical behavior, etc. So, we get caught in a little pickle with all that, for sure.
Yeah, it reminds me of lots of learning we've been doing within our membership recently. The book we read before your book was Canine Enrichment for the Real World by Emily Strong and Ellie Bender. And just remind me, in ATA we've been leaning on, and we continue to lean on, Susan Friedman's hierarchy of behavior change interventions, and just to acknowledge in myself the priority I've put on the third turnoff on that roadmap, which is positive reinforcement. And to have these conversations and highlight those first 2 turnoffs before we reach that operant position, have we met needs, is joyous to me to be reminded of it and to have these conversations. I used a lot of words there that I'm curious to hear in your words the definitions of. So can we just go through a few terms?
Sure.
First, ontogeny.
Okay, so that's an ethological or evolutionary term that just refers to the development of an organism over the course of their lifetime.
And then you said emergent behavior.
Yes, and if anyone wants to really geek out on that, go into Ray Coppinger's work. His books cover that extensively. But emergent behaviors are basically pieces of modal action patterns that emerge at different points in development, so that the animal is starting to kind of rehearse going through some of those motions. And they just pop out at the appropriate times. And so even play, through this particular perspective and understanding of play, that evolutionary kind of angle on it, is really just clusters of emergent behaviors that are being practiced and engaged with in a way that results in the animal having fun. We call it play, but the reason that it's fun, the reason that it feels good, is because modal action patterns release dopamine when they're engaged in. And so it feels good to engage in those little instinctual pieces of those sequences. And so that's what emergent behaviors are. They just emerge at different points in development.
Now, I have to ask to define modal action patterns, please.
Sure. So modal action patterns are kind of the updated concept of what used to be called fixed action patterns. The fixed action pattern was the discussion of the idea of this genetic or biological basis for certain instinctual behaviors that would emerge and then play out very statically, repetitively in response to conditions in the environment that acted as releasers for those behaviors. So Konrad Lorenz's, goose egg rolling is an example many people are familiar with. But basically, the idea that there would be certain things in the environment that then would trigger a latent behavioral software program that's instinctual. And the idea is that the emphasis, anyway, is that it doesn't go through the filter of executive function. It bypasses that. And that's all about nature's principles of economy of behavior. It takes more energy for things to go through executive function. It wouldn't be very efficient economically in nature if everything was Groundhog Day and you had to start over and relearn all the time. And so not only is learning a mechanism for making things easier and more fluid going forward, but that's the cool thing about looking at things like modal action patterns, that being, again, the updated definition of fixed action patterns, just referring to the fact that they're more flexible. It's not as particular, like stamped out rigid as the original thought of fixed action patterns. They're more flexible than that. But nonetheless, they are very powerful because they have generations of reinforcement history behind them. And so that's an even more efficient way for nature to ensure that if it is a behavior that has worked that well for that long, for that many individuals over that many generations, they want to make sure that that individual animal, even if it's not externally reinforced for that behavior for a long period of time, still keeps it in the bank, is ready to play that card if the condition presents itself again. It doesn't, in other words, want the animal to habituate or desensitize to that particular signal, and then that appropriate response in that condition. It doesn't want the behavior to extinguish. If an instinct is there, in nature's definition, right? Not necessarily our artificial selection, but under nature's rules, uninhibited by us. If it's there as an instinct, it was really important. Otherwise, it would have been selected against. It's kind of like a behavior being abandoned because it's not working.
Got it. Releasing stimuli.
So releasing stimuli, also called releasers, interacting with those modal action patterns. So those are signals. If you think about all this, really, just to kind of step over here for a minute, you can look at all this through ABA language, which is fun. So you could look at everything we were talking about with modal action patterns as just operant strategies that have been successful through generations. Cool way to look at it. And they don't have to go through all that hard work of going through executive function in order to pop out. They're just ready to go. And in terms of releasers or releasing stimuli, you can think of that as classical conditioning. So basically, those are just associations that have been formed to give meaning to things in the environment. So if I think that this means this, so let's say this means food opportunity. So say the color red for a hummingbird is a really common example that you can think about. They're just going to be attracted to red. They don't know why they're attracted to red. They're just attracted to red because that is a releaser for foraging behavior. So there's lots of different types of releasers for lots of different types of behaviors.
And then the last one was latent impulses.
latent impulses. And so that's just my phrasing more than a technical term, but impulses is another way to think about a modal action pattern. And so in my book, I'll use that term impulses just as a kind of user-friendly way to talk to the public about those genetic strategies that have actually been passed on through generations.
Right. So in your example, we've got a dog that I'm going to label it as a herding dog, releasing stimuli, which we could broadly categorize as fast-moving objects, just in our human environment, which might be a skateboard, and then we get some emergent behaviors, modal action patterns like stalking, chasing,
barking, chasing, nipping,
behaviors that have evolutionarily worked for this breed of dog. In their selective breeding from humans. Can you say evolutionarily worked? Is it in the short period of time that humans have been breeding them, or does that require in that sense,
it would be artificial selection. So technically it's not really evolutionary. It would be just artificially selected. So where you draw the line on kind of humans intervening in natural selection, and then it would still be evolutionary, was, let's say, hundreds of years ago, there was a man who had a number of dogs, and the one who did a great job herding, he was giving preferential treatment to, so giving more food to. And maybe he was culling other individuals he didn't like the work of as well. So culling and favoring are two examples of humans' involvement or participation in the natural selection evolutionary process. So that is one way that, yes, we threw our hat in the ring early on. But for some time now, we've been doing a lot more than that because we're actually controlling their reproduction.
And so, having only read the introduction to your book thus far, once again, not ideal to do the podcast first, but timing and schedules and everything like that. You mentioned how one thing that's happened in Western society is the marketing of pets has confused and misinformed the general populace about what all of the stuff we've just talked about, they're bringing into their home. Is that where the conflict currently is, and where there's space for us to have conversations like this?
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important that, podcasts like this and professional conversations and platforms, that we realize that there's no us versus them. There's no people who think that the model needs to change and you're revolting against the people who don't. We are the pet industry, right? Like, we are the ones in the position to change and redefine paradigms and concepts and attitudes and expectations. And so I see it very much as our responsibility to get clearer in ourselves about the reality of the modern predicament for dogs, and then to communicate that effectively with the public, because most of the breeds of dogs out there were not bred to be pets. That was not the niche that the artificial selective pressure was aiming towards. So we all know, those of us who've worked with animals in farms or zoo types of settings, we know that if you take an animal out of their natural habitat and you put it into a captive environment that does not have the affordances that give them the opportunity to express those natural behaviors, that we see a lot of unhealthy behavior in those captive animals, right? We see a lot of repetitive, neurotic, excessive, explosive, stereotypical behavior if that environment does not provide them the opportunity to express those impulses, those instincts that they carry. So it kind of compounds on itself, and with a herding dog being a wonderful example of the peak of this phenomenon, we created a very intense, hardworking dog that you could even argue in a herding environment breaks some of the fundamental laws of nature, in that nature is very economical. It doesn't want any organism to spend energy it doesn't need to spend, because you might need that energy for really important things, right? Like finding your next meal, defending your young, rebuilding a nest, any number of things that would be real problems that you could have in the natural world. And we've created such a hardworking, intense animal that could work those long days at our side that, again, arguably is already breaking some of those economy of behavior rules that would have made nature select against it in the first place. place. And then we put it in a sedentary captive environment, maybe where the dog is living indoors 21, 22 hours a day. I mean, that's actually really common. If you see a herding dog living in an urban environment, pet home, where people work, their kids go to school, they don't have any livestock, where that dog might get a 30-minute walk in the morning and maybe an hour walk at night. And that's literally it, that is not the environment, the habitat, the niche for which that dog was developed. And right off the bat, you can go ahead and make a very confident assumption you're going to have compromised welfare and, quote, behavior problems, which I am encouraging people to look at as evidence, symptoms of the dysfunction of that animal's phenotype, and what in nature would be a balance between their legs, which is what the book's about, the balance between their learning, their environment, their genetics, and their self. So when nature's checks and balances is interrupted and that animal can't help themselves by those two mechanisms we talked about before, through either their own choice of changing their behavior or through reproducing differently to try to create some different types of genetic material to work with that might give that animal an opportunity to be more successful, or his offspring subsequently, then we've quite handicapped them, we've cornered them.
Well, hey, you've already explained and I think emphasized why this is important, but we're going to talk more about that soon. Just wondering, at this point, you mentioned your book, we've mentioned your book, Meet Your Dogs, and you just mentioned the program that is part of that and part of everything you're doing, Legs. Can you, before we move into the next part of this episode, share with everyone what you're up to now and where they can go online to find out more about some of the things that we've mentioned at various parts of this podcast episode so far?
Sure. Yeah. So our website, which is dogdoorbehaviorcenter.com, has a lot of information, both for the public as well as for pros. I think it's also helpful for people to see some examples of the kinds of language that you can actually use in speaking with the public there. So it's not that we're just out in some abstract land of some various scientific concepts. There's pages and content that were built for the public. And yet can explain these concepts in a meaningful way to them. And on the pros page, for those who are working with behavior professionally or in the veterinary or sheltering and rescue worlds, or even in, working in zoos or farms and might therefore have some interest in the concepts, they can go to that pros page, get some information about the course there. And there's a link to the course page from there. And that has a lot more information about the whole model and the program and, frankly, the movement that is underway in the industry to try to create a meaningful paradigm shift.
Now, is that course available for anyone to start at any point in time, or are you launching that at various times throughout the year?
Yep, it's start and complete at your own pace. And so it's a full online course. We have a Facebook group to support our students and continue those questions and dialogues. It was just launched on the 30th, so just about 5 days ago. And we've got about 350 students taking it at the moment. And it's open to anyone else internationally who would like to take it at their own leisure and their own pace.
Well, congratulations on getting it launched. That's exciting.
Thank you. It's very, very exciting to see how well the information is received. I'm very much hoping it can make a difference.
Well, we'll link to all of that in the show notes for you listening, if you wanted an easy location to go find it all. Thanks so much for sharing everything so far, Kim. What I normally say here is we love hearing about people's behavioural odysseys, but we didn't talk much about all of the things that you did throughout your career because I had too many questions. So thank you for answering all those questions. I had more and I'm reining myself in. You and I caught up a few weeks ago and I asked you what you would most like to share with our audience on this podcast episode today. You mentioned you were keen to share your thoughts on why you think we should focus on the why. Why you think we should focus on the why of our learners' behaviour. And so you've kindly compiled 5 reasons to build on everything that we've talked about so far and to help guide our understanding of your perspective. 5 reasons you feel we should focus on the why of our learners' behaviour. I'm excited to dive into this part of the episode. Kim, could you please start us off with number 1?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. It's a fun opportunity to kind of frame this. As a brief introduction, just I think that our industry has very much been focused on how to change behavior, and it's a very exciting set of weeds to get lost in, which will lead me into my reason number one on why I think we should focus on why more than just how. It's amazing what you can do with operant and classical conditioning. It is amazing what you can do with applied behavior analysis. And I think we sometimes forget to check our human selves to recognize how inherently invasive and powerful it is to modify the behavior of another. So we have this amazing toolkit and all of this knowledge at our fingertips. We can do phenomenal things. But should we? When do we? Should we, in some cases, be looking at the behavior as more evidence of something else going on underneath it? In which case, why would we want to mask the information that the behavior might be giving us about something deeper that's going on underneath the surface? And so I think instead of being so quick to jump into a program of how to change behavior, knowing darn well we are all capable of doing so, it's really important to step back, recognize the tremendous responsibility we have because of the power that we wield, and then we very carefully and deliberately apply it in the interest of that animal's welfare and, of course, the welfare of the family that is living with the animal. But even humane methods can cause a lot of problems because it's possible, of course, to manipulate behavior and change behavior, even through humane methods, without the active participation of the learner. And what I mean by that is I think a lot of the indicators that we have agreed are evidence that the dog likes it or that the dog is enjoying learning. Are whether the animal voluntarily engages with us, whether the animal seems eager and excited about engaging in the behavior, whether the animal wants to do it again. But we forget that a lot of these, say, instincts that we were talking about, things like modal action patterns, et cetera, a lot of the behaviors, frankly, that we have developed dogs for historically, those behaviors are meant to emerge in a very aroused sense in response to the conditions that we selected them for. We wanted the dog that would work. We didn't want a dog that's over there sleeping by the porch, unwilling to come help us kill the rat that just ran across our porch or herd the sheep that just got out of the paddock. So we needed dogs that in a way would be behavior junkies and would be quick to engage and feel reinforced by engaging in behaviors. So oftentimes dogs are engaging in behaviors against their own will, literally on a genetic level. And then, of course, we all know that marketing does this to us all the time. We can create associations or even behavioral strategies subconsciously because we've been conditioned to think a certain way or act a certain way. The whole world of marketing is completely designed around tapping into this part of our brain and manipulating us against our will. So all that said, that's point number one. It's a tremendous responsibility that we consider why before we consider the how. And if you want, I'll move into number two, or you can ask a question.
Awesome. Hey, thank you for all of that. Quickly wondering, can you give us an example of where you feel we might be focusing on the operant? So let's say a typical or a common behavioral challenge from a client where you feel you might see needs not being met with the dog and what you might label as focusing too much on training and teaching new behaviors.
Mm-hmm. So I think whether we were using other dogs or other people as the example, just thinking about, say, the selections for sociability in dogs as an example, which is widespread among many of the different genetic groups of dogs, the selection for sociability with humans and in some cases very much with other animals. And of course, they have their own evolutionary historical reasons for having been selected for sociability, with other animals. And so there's a lot of dogs that are essentially living in social vacuums with their own family, and they may just live with one or two people. And if that person lives a busy lifestyle, they may be working long hours. They may have limited availability to be with that dog socially throughout the day. And then so that dog, when that person comes home, particularly if there are other social individuals also suddenly available, like guests that come home with them, et cetera, that dog is likely to be excessive about their attention and sociability seeking behavior because those needs haven't been met. And this is not a type of animal that is supposed to be spending the vast majority of their time in isolation and captivity inside your apartment while you're gone all day, right? And so if we crate them while we're gone during the day, or even if they're just in the living room, then we come home, we've got just maybe, 30 minutes for a walk or something, pop them back in the living room. We go out for dinner with friends, come back later, and the dog is literally, whining and bringing the ball again and again, jumping on people, and say, oh, stop being so annoying. You're always up in everyone's faces, trying to lick them, trying to get their attention. Go away, go lay down. So, whether we're using positive methods or otherwise to get a dog to say, go lay down and, settle on their mat when people come home, if we don't address, well, why is this dog so absolutely desperate for attention in the first place? And frankly, you'd probably find there was a genetic and an environmental reason for that. So we bred dogs to be excessively attention seeking because those dogs are often the result of our selection for really friendly dogs. We want the golden retrievers that'll be good with kids, but then we don't want the other stuff that comes with that selective result of having a dog that's super human centric and sociable because they're needy. And so that's just one example among many of just how the dog's social needs might not being met at all, not be being met. And then we are frustrated with the results of that, and we just attempt to train away the symptoms.
Well, I think we can all understand that example. I think even with my own dog being having a toddler and a business to run, even though I'm physically present, there are needs there that could benefit from more resources. Let's put it that way. It's amazing.
And we're all in that boat, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like, you said there being respectful. I can't remember the words you use of the clients and the family, and so it's a challenge to. What do you have to say to professionals, to behaviour consultants and trainers working with families who want the behaviour trained?
I think we have to get more comfortable being honest with people about, so let's say it is a golden retriever. I actually find the clients are really interested in and get a lot of insight out of getting the facts and the information. So, for instance, people can look this up too, but Williams-Buren syndrome is a syndrome in human beings that is related to excessive sociability in humans. So less filters in terms of social behavior, interactions, et cetera. And it goes along with some physical traits that make the individual appear maybe a little bit more juvenile. And so they've actually found that the mutations that individual humans carry that have Williams-Buren syndrome, that dogs carry mutations on the same segment of their DNA as people that have Williams-Buren syndrome. And so the recent thinking is that this explains a lot about dogs' excessive sociability, which of course we liked. We thought was fantastic in dogs, that they were less aggressive and more pro-social. A lot of, the hypothesizing around this is that it is a side effect of selecting for temperament. And so therefore neoteny, or the preservation of juvenile traits throughout adulthood. The people will find a lot of stuff out there about that. Also, Coppinger talks about that a great deal. But so we breed these dogs for traits that we like, that friendliness, lack of aggression, etc. But we're actually pulling one string genetically where other things come along with it, so that dog is more social centric, needy, etc. And then you mash that up with our modern lives and lifestyles that are largely indoor, We're on these computers and black box phones and tablets and things all the time. Those are things that dogs can't share with us. It's not even like we can be having an experience together. I think we forget to put our own existence into context and recognize that humans 100 years ago were still spending the vast majority of their time outside. That is not the case now. Our world has changed completely in the last century. And frankly, they would barely have had the time to evolve and keep up if we'd let them. You add on top of that, we don't let them evolve because of those two mechanisms of autonomy of behavior and autonomy of reproduction, and they can't, even if they wanted to.
So number one is just tremendous responsibility.
Yes, exactly.
Please carry us forward into number two.
Okay. So number two, which we touched on just a moment ago, but of why to focus on why before how, is that recognizing that in nature, behavior is adaptive, logical, and functional and economical, because by definition, nature selects against what doesn't work. Because if it's not working, you won't secure resources, you won't be able to successfully survive, and you won't be able to successfully reproduce because things aren't working. So nature selects against it if what you are and what you're doing isn't working in the conditions. So it's this kind of system of perfect descent with modification for the conditions an animal finds themselves in. So anything that's not logical, excessive, explosive, neurotic, etc., like we were talking about border collies or herding dogs, would get selected against as maladaptive. So when you think about that and you think about the incredible frequency and commonality of maladaptive, explosive, neurotic, excessive, dysfunctional behavior in the pet dog population, that should give us immediate pause that something isn't working, because this is unnatural. It is unnatural for behavior to be those things. Nature is selecting against it in every organism. So then where does that leave us? Questioning, probably looking back at the environmental conditions and then the genetic conditions and why those two things are not working well together as a lock and a key. So again, asking why means we might actually get closer to a meaningful solution instead of continuing to beat our head against a wall, scratching at the surface.
Behaviour, I feel like I've missed a word out here. Maybe I haven't, but if I have, feel free to chuck it in. Behaviour is logical, functional, and economical.
Yes, and adaptive.
And adaptive, there's the word. I couldn't type as fast as you were talking. All makes sense. Let's jump ahead to number three, please.
Okay, and this will touch on something that you were just asking about in terms of how we deal with the public, how we deal with our clientele when they say, hey, I need you to fix this behavior. The entire dog training industry, the whole concept of dog training, and even the words dog training, obedience, commands, compliance, etc. They all connote this expectation that it is our job to train, fix, change, and control the behavior. And so as a result of that, if we continue to emphasize with the public in our dialogues, in our materials like our brochures, our business cards, our websites, etc., I'm a dog trainer. I can train your dog. I can fix these behaviors. I can guarantee success in modifying anything. And we continue to promote this idea of it's just a matter of how. And boy, I'm so good at the how part, I can get some amazing results. We're doing a tremendous disservice, not just to those dogs right in front of us, but to culture as a whole, because the ripple effects of that are that person goes and they talk to their family members or their neighbors or their friends about the dog trainer coming in who they've hired to change and fix and control the behavior. And we've not gotten any closer to the truth and the heart of the matter. And so it's just kind of, if anything, at best, punting down the road to where someone else is going to have to pick up that ball and do something with it later. And frankly, the situation is snowballing and catching up with us quite rapidly.
And I was going to express gratitude earlier because subtly I suggested, I think, an us versus them mentality when I said the pet industry, but we are the pet industry.
Right. We are the pet industry. It's on us, right? Who else is going to do it, And yet, if we create the pressure for some of the larger companies, I hope that some of the larger companies and product manufacturers and things like that will start to get on board. But we have to kind of pull the curtain back for the public first.
And so number 3 is, I'm going to phrase it, I'm sure different than how you would. It has to do with how would you phrase it? The language we're using, expectations.
Yeah, expectations. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Expectations related to our industry, and how that is either moving towards or away from truth. Why moving us towards truth? How? Not necessarily.
So a lot of emphasis gets put on, your website is your best marketing collateral. What are some ideas you might have, some suggestions how we could communicate via a medium such as our website, how we can help our clients with what they're going to be labeling as their problems and their inconveniences? What is some potential language we can use?
So again, I encourage folks to check out my website because they'll see right off the bat on the home page and in the pages, the pages are actually set up for dogs, for families, and for pros. And so it's interesting. The For Dogs page, obviously the dogs aren't going and reading the website, but the entire For Dogs page content is meant to be from your dog's perspective. So it's us speaking to the dog for the benefit of the client, which I think is a very helpful way to get at the heart of things like, dog training. Gosh, it sounds so condescending, doesn't it? As if you're the only one who has, some things that need looking at and changing in the situation in your family environment, just kind of like, and through our voice, validating the dog's experience. That is one way to get at the public's perception. And then when we do have the page for the families, it's not like, oh, you've got it all wrong trying to change your dog's behavior by training them. It's really taking ownership as an industry. So the industry has given you some wrong concepts. You've been marketed some ideas that weren't entirely true because the industry's aim was to get the public to buy products and services. And frankly, the dogs were the first product that they had to sell in order to sell all the other products and services. So just for them to recognize that they're caught up in a narrative that is not giving them the explanation. And what I've found that's been really quite surprising in the last decade, people really want to understand. They want an explanation, most of them. Some don't, and they can go on down the street to someone else as far as I'm concerned. But most of my clients, they want to understand what's happening. Why is he doing it? What does it mean? And frankly, they've already beat themselves up for feeling like they're not a good enough dog trainer and maybe they're doing something wrong and they just haven't read the right book or hired the right pro yet or spent enough money or use the magic words. And so you're actually providing relief to the family to say, it's not you. You didn't do anything wrong. It's not your dog. You didn't fail. You haven't been given the tools and the insights to get to the bottom of the situation for really meaningful change. And I think right there is the hook to the heart of, oh, okay, something different. And that's actually been the experience we've had with clients is that people often cry in their first appointment and say, this is the first time that my dog's behavior has actually made sense. And then the way that we tend to approach our behavior cases is a lot of hack-centric stuff that is like how to do a lot of deep antecedent arrangement, including their expectations being antecedents for changing behavior and the reality for everyone in the household.
A million questions that I won't ask because we're going to push on to number 4, please.
Okay. So just kind of one further step beyond the point 1 about responsibility. If we get the why part wrong when we are doing an assessment of a dog's behavior in a case, then our how risks confusing the dog, which is aversive, right? So if we don't get the nail on the head and understand what it's about in the first place, and we send the behavior in another direction, the animal might find themselves engaging in the new behavior pattern that we've created because we can create reinforcement around it. But the animal themselves might not cognitively make sense for them. So it might create some cognitive dissonance. So like, let's say, for instance, that the dog is wanting attention from someone when they come in the door. We'll use that example again. And they're really hyper and they're explosive because they're spending too much time by themselves, not getting those social needs met, et cetera. And we teach an out to a bed, to a place, and a stay behavior. And we do that operantly and positively. And then we reinforce with food. But for the dog, it's all about the seeking of the social behavior. So they're like, okay, so I know if I go to the bed, I get the food, but how do I get the social interaction? So I think, using more Premack is something that we could always benefit from. But I think if we don't get that why part correct, we're likely to play whack-a-mole and kind of can create some circus in the dog's mind. I've actually seen a lot of dogs that were heavily operantly trained using only positive reinforcement that were beside themselves in confusion, like not even understanding why they're doing the behaviors they're doing, but doing them because they have a reinforcement history created around them with some additional reinforcer that the dog found rewarding enough that it was able to change the behavior, but not necessarily had anything to do with what the behavior was about in the first place.
So it's reminding me a lot of the learning I'm doing from people like Sean Will, Jesus Rosales Ruiz, Joe Lang, and using a constructional approach and actual reinforces the dogs are after. So teaching the same, but would you say one of our responsibilities might be teaching the more the behaviours that allow us to coexist together in our homes, but leveraging the naturally occurring reinforcers the dogs are after in the first place?
100%. For anyone who ends up, taking the course or reading the book for that matter, you will see constant reflections of the centrality of Premack to everything that I'm doing, because that's basically evolutionary, right? That's basically ethological. In nature, everything has to be functional, purposeful, logical, adaptive. So you do a behavior because in that moment, that's the behavior you need to do to effectively, functionally interact with your environment for survival. So to do some extraneous behavior that is not to the point of what you were doing in the first place and why you were doing it, what you were trying to accomplish, is frankly confusing. And I think sometimes because we're doing it through positive means, we don't recognize just how aversive that can be to the learner, because it feels super left field. Like they're like, but I wanted to socially interact. I need oxytocin. I need connection and relationship and bonding to feel safe in my environment. And I'm doing tricks and getting treats and playing ball, but I'm not getting all the things that I'm actually seeking. I'm doing other stuff and it fills the space. But I actually feel like I've seen, and I say this very cautiously because I am very much a believer in positive reinforcement, but I feel like I've seen a real increase in cases where the dog has a serious mental health crisis going on because they're being overtrained through positive operant strategies that are not what you were talking about, leveraging the kind of natural occurring motivations in the environment, the Premack.
So it's not necessarily about not using positive reinforcement. It's just maybe a discussion and consideration of the reinforcers that you're using in any behavior that you're intervening in.
Right. I really like to stay in the ABC. So I look at it like, if the dog is employing this behavior to try to get this particular outcome, that our job is to show them which behaviors work to get that outcome and which behaviors don't work to get that outcome, because that's how nature works. As opposed to, well, you could come over here and have this outcome, or if you go over there, you'll get this outcome. When it's like, okay, all that can change behavior, but did it answer the question the dog had in the first place, which is, how can I fill in the blank? Did we answer that question? That's our job, as far as I see it, being a tour guide to that, a coach, a parent, upper management. Sue Sternberg, I was watching a presentation she just did for the APDT conference, and she was talking at being their escort, let me show you how this works. I think sometimes we overthink things, frankly, because we because you can do so much cool stuff operantly that sometimes, we go 3 times around the globe just to walk 2 feet, when it's not necessarily what's helping the animal, and it's not necessarily the most practical magical, easy way to solve a problem. I would say that's another surprising thing about this whole approach and shift in paradigm is oftentimes training is rendered obsolete because of the shifts in understanding and antecedents and the kind of recognition on the part of the family members about what's really going on. All of their behavior changes, actually. And it turned out it wasn't even a dog training issue in the first place.
All of the challenges we see.
Right.
Number 5.
Right. Okay. So number 5 is that behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum. So you have this complicated interaction of all of these variables that is working together to create the behavior that we're seeing. Okay, so even though in theory, like in radical behaviorism, there's room for all of these complex variables of the animal's phenotypes. Another way to think about that is their legs. So all the collective factors of the learning, the environment, the genetics, and then that individual self, all of those variables. We tend to practice when we're emphasizing the how of this, what Nicholas Tinbergen, an ethologist, called more proximate considerations. So things that are, specific to this individual and their experience and their lifetime. And so we don't necessarily step back and look at what Tinbergen referred to as the other side, the ultimate antecedents for a behavior. So the evolutionary, the genetic contributors that are setting that stage. And so if we proceed with the how without understanding both the proximate and the ultimate why, then we can create more dysfunction between those animals' legs because there's this huge missing piece of the puzzle. They just, if we don't understand, for instance, the genetic selections, and so we think the behavior is about this, but if we just knew what the genetic selective pressures were, it would be like a light bulb going off, like, oh, that's what that is, and that's why it's happening. And now I know that it has generations of reinforcement history behind it. So I need to A, provide it a healthy outlet of expression, and B, not expect that it's not going to show up somewhere somehow. And so what do I do with that information? Of course, in that how part, it's going to be really different depending on whether or not we are digging into that full proximate and ultimate analysis of behavior.
Behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum. Number 1 was, and I'm going to butcher the wordings of all of these bullet points in comparison to how you might say them. So bear with me. Number 1 is a tremendous responsibility. Mm-hmm. Number 2, behavior is logical, functional, adaptive, and economical. Number 3, just a discussion around consideration of and review of expectations that we might be placing in those we interact with as professionals. Number 4, we might be confusing the dog through the contingencies that we're offering it. And when we consider the actual function of the original behavior versus the new contingencies, often involving food that we provide. Number 5, behavior does not occur in a vacuum.
Good job.
Thank God I made notes. You've already answered this, I'm sure, but final words, what do you really want to see happen over the next 5 to 10 years in our industry?
Well, I would have thought 10 years ago that it was a pipe dream if I was chatting with a friend at a conference. And seeing what's happened in the last year or two, I actually think it's possible that this could happen in the next 5 or 10 years. I think we need a complete and total market disruption and a redefinition of our industry, our jobs, our roles, and the model to shift, and to me, that's towards an idea of family dog mediation, where we can sit between these two different species and we can sort it all out and put a plan together for them moving forward so that they can harmoniously coexist. Because at the end of the day, that's what clients really want to do. Most of them really don't care about fancy stuff. They really just want to enjoy life with their dog and have their dog enjoy life with them. And so I think getting out of our own way, honestly, getting our ego out of it. I am so tired of hearing dog trainers fight with each other and throw things at each other about what way they're doing something and condemn this or that, when there are so many more important conversations we need to be having. And frankly, we all need to be having those conversations, so that no matter what someone chooses as the how, if we could at least all get closer to being on the same page about the why, maybe we would find we had more in common than we thought. Maybe there'd be a lot less divisiveness and we could do a lot more good for dogs and people. But this is a cultural effort we're after here. This isn't even just an industry effort.
Well, I think if you're throwing things at someone else, we need to ask what needs of yours aren't being met as well. Hey,
right.
We've already mentioned this, but where can people go online? Can you remind everyone, please, to learn more about this, learn about family dog mediation, learn about legs, learn about Meet Your Dog, get in touch if they have any questions or queries. Where's the best place for people to find you online?
So for just more information and poking around, the Dog Door behaviorcenter.com. They can find me there. Actually, if they just want to hear a bunch of other fun podcast episodes too, there's actually a number of those available online. And there's even I'm not remembering it right now, but there's a landing page where you can go and put in anyone's name and all the podcasts they've ever been on come up. So you can find them all in one place, which is kind of cool. If you just want to hear some, different discussions around it. The Beyond the Operant talks are really a fun place for people to dig in and nerd out. Conversations with my co-hosts, Andrew Hale and Kathy Murphy, talking about all of these issues. The book, of course, and then I hope that folks do consider looking into the material in the course. There's a downloadable course outline and a lot more information about it that you can connect to from my website. And then anyone that just wants to connect with me personally, feel free to reach out on Facebook Messenger, contact me through my personal page, Kim Brophey. I love meeting colleagues from around the world and having these important conversations. This is not just about me, and that's something I can't emphasize enough. If I could take myself out of the equation and still do what I needed to do, I would, because the spotlight isn't my thing, right? But this information is really my thing. And I think I would like to put out an invitation to any passionate, compassionate individual in the industry to just join the conversation and learn more and get involved and find what role they can play in turning the tide if they're so moved.
Wonderful. Well, if you listening are moved, I'm sure there's a ton of questions I could have asked today, areas we could have explored, and if you're anything like me, then you are filled with those questions as well. So we'll link to everything that Kim's just mentioned in our show notes, or you can go on Google or online, find them all yourself. Kim, this has been a ton of fun. I'm looking forward to connecting with you again in December within our membership for a live Q&A with our members after we've all, including myself, have finished your book. So for now, though, from myself and on behalf of everyone listening, we really appreciate you taking the time to come and hang out with us at Animal Training Academy. It's really appreciated.
Oh, thank you again for having me. It's really been fun for me, too.
We do, of course, really appreciate all of you tuning in today as well. And if you have enjoyed this episode and you were interested in carrying on the conversation about working with our animals in the most positive, funnest, choice-rich ways, then as mentioned at the start of this episode, the Animal Training Academy community is waiting for you. Head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com and click on the membership button in the main menu to learn more about what members are describing as the Netflix social media platform for behaviour geeks. That's it for this episode though. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again so much everyone for listening. You'll hear from us again soon.